Hello, thank you for coming. I've changed the title a bit, though it's still about cultural models and whether they're part of a conversation or whether they actually have any utility in research and as a useful concept. I think a better title, because the paper is more dramatic than I had intended it to be, is perhaps Anthropology at the Crossroads. So let me begin. It should be about 15 minutes long, and if John Gatewood is there, I'd like to say, hi, John. Good to see you. Good that you're there. There's an alarm that goes on and off in the background. Hopefully it'll go off soon. I feel as if I've been standing at a crossroads in terms of my understanding of culture and cognition, particularly in terms of the role and reality of cultural models. Not the legendary crossroads of Robert Johnson fame, but one where all roads are without signs and radiate out across a vast empty plain. Or alternatively, it feels as if we anthropologists are at a crossroads in the center of a marketplace where one can go in any direction to buy anything. I am speaking, of course, not just of my crossroads, but that of anthropology as a discipline, where everything goes, no one listens to anything, and where we live in the permanent subjunctive. Would, could. We are at the crossroads where Wolff's vision of anthropology as the most humanistic and scientific of the social sciences has long since combusted, and pockets of anthropologists wander with no direction home. It seems appropriate that these wayfaring clubs of anthropologists question the utility of the concept of culture, given that there is no culture of anthropology that serves as a family home. In what follows, I will elaborate a bit on the following claims: that the mind and culture are similar concepts because culture is in the mind and both are, in Carruthers' words, opaque. We cannot deny the central importance of the concept of culture without becoming an incoherent, worthless discipline. Purposeful or appropriate behavior must be caused by something like cultural models. Cultural models are basic, but not the only basic unit of culture. We need to get together and collaborate deeply to reintroduce a coherent, legible concept of culture to anthropology. Similarly, we need to develop criteria for determining the adequacy of cultural models or affordances, another kind of mental model I propose, taken from Gibson and later Hypo and Meehan. Cultural models and affordances, or their like, must be central concepts in anthropology. Without collaborating on how to define and use these terms, according to some criteria of adequacy, we will fail to develop a paradigmatic concept of culture that unifies the field of anthropology. You cannot have qualitatively different conceptions of evolution, personality, variables, or social status without disrupting the disciplines in which these particular terms play a central role. Let me be more explicit. Culture is what anthropologists study, as it is manifested in behavior and as well as in biological and artifactual remains. The art and science of anthropology is to recognize culture as a system. Finally it's off. Let's hope it stays off. To recognize culture as a system that we humans use to act intentionally and to make sense of the world around us. We all know this. We make and communicate meaning by utilizing culture. There must be an art or humanistic angle that is foundational to the study of culture because of the inherent opacity of the cultural concept. This opacity is analogous to the opacity of minds, as argued again by Carruthers. We cannot apprehend either the mind or culture directly. We just infer them. I think the theories of such famous scholars as Kahneman, Millikan, Dennett, and even Margaret Gilbert fail because they seek to understand the mind. And more specifically, collective cognition, without taking culture into account. We anthropologists are better off because we do have a theory of collective thought. I will not go into the problem with theory, simulation, or interactional theory. These are all theories by philosophers of mind reading. Well, interactional theory is not of mind reading, it's the opposite. But except to point out that they all deal with social cognition of mental states as if the mental state is what generates, there it goes again, as if mental states is what generate cognition or cognitive processes. I don't believe in fast and slow thinking, nor in mental states per se. I believe that most all mental states not produced by immediate sensory input are infected by culture. To use Robert Levy's theory of hypo and hypercognition, I conjecture that the speed of thinking, except that which is reflexive, like pain or distress, depends on the degree to which aspects of perception are culturally hypo or hypercognized. One can see this as a continuum, not just of emotions, but of rational thought as well. The more hypercognized a thing is, the more elaborate and the more cultural symbols are infused into perceiving and thinking about that thing. Into perceiving and thinking about that thing. Hence, the slower thinking. There is no system 1 and there is no system 2. So, for instance, in cultures that have elaborated the concept of romantic love as opposed to those that haven't, there are a multiplicity of ways to express romantic love. In those where love is not elaborated, the feeling might easily be interpreted as simply the person being emotionally high-strung, or that the feeling is simply a form of aim-inhibited sex. We have no way of tapping into the cultural part that is necessary to produce our thoughts and actions. What Kahneman and other psychologists miss is a thoughtful, well-developed theory of culture. I think Cronenfeld has developed the most significant and best theory of culture available on the market today. I think it is an index of how ruptured anthropology is that he is not considered one of the major theoreticians of our time. Nevertheless, as is imperative of all former students, in what follows I will briefly point out an area of culture which his theory has neglected. What I think is important in what I'm going to say below is not necessarily the content, but my attempt to push us collectively farther than we seem ready to go and towards a synthesis rather than a splintering of the scientific and humanistic facets that make anthropology a unique and worthwhile discipline. Okay, so part 2. Culture is by definition collective, yet it must reside in the individual mind. Cronenfeld has argued that there is no collective mind, but that we have an individual representation of a collective representation, and this creates, in Kahneman's words, a cognitive illusion that we can read each other's minds. We can read minds only because we believe that we share more or less the same cultural models as other people do. We interpret behavior, including thoughts, as culturally produced, but we have no way of tapping into the cultural part that produces those actions. We neither have a way of grasping the sharedness of an idea or act or word, nor of grasping our own knowledge of that idea or act. Yet we are just as aware of an act as appropriate, slightly inappropriate, or completely inappropriate, whether we are the actors or audience. This will become clear soon. For instance, I hope, if I go into a class dressed in a tuxedo or in a dress, the students and I would both know that this is inappropriate. But it is not as inappropriate as entering the classroom stark naked. I have, in a sense, equal access to how the class and I feel. I do not have privileged access to either my interiority or that of the students. But that is irrelevant, because I act as if I do, and I believe that I do because of culture, and that belief serves me well through life. The absence of access to culture or mind, that is, their dual opacity, is evident only from outside, sitting here writing about it. Inside my individual model of the collective model, it works, and because my model is perceived by me to be a collective model, and this proposition or belief works for all of us most of the time, only due to this illusion do I feel confident that culture exists and works in all of us similarly. It is like Wittgenstein's grasshopper in a pouch. Each of us can peek into our own pouch and see our own grasshopper, but we have no access to the contents of the pouches of others. However, because they have pouches, thank God, and peer inside regularly, we assume that they also have a grasshopper in their pouch. Except with cultural models, just as for the self, we can introspect all we want without ever finding culture. Cultural models of ourself. Without ever finding culture, cultural models, or ourself. There is no ambiguity due to the illusory nature of culture, self, or mind. The notion of cultural models is like a weed notion. It has taken root in all fields of the social, behavioral sciences, and humanities. Yet it is as if we were back on the crossroads of the marketplace. We can buy any and every kind of cultural model that ever was from any shop. The problem with that is we each take our own conceptions of cultural models and how to find and describe them without getting together and deciding what are the criteria by which we identify whether or not X is an academic model, and what type of cultural models are there, how do they work, how do we represent them, and the range of acceptable variation within them. Finally, I would like to venture a bit further out to explore another kind of cognitive process. Affordances, or the contentless mind, which seems to me a bit like fast thinking, Kahneman's term. One feature of culture is that we can place ourselves on automatic pilot as we go through our everyday routines. It requires a minimum of thinking. It seems the case that I don't need a full-blown cultural model to do what I do most of the time. All I need is a simple cue, a kind of ecological affordance. For example, if I see my friend smile, I am motivated to crack a joke. Or if I see my wife frown at me, then I sit up and pay attention. When we are engaged in routine behavior, we simply ride on the minimal cues by which we can generate behavior. One can see how the distinction between affordances, the contentless mind, and cultural models can be united along a continuum theory of cultural elaboration or complexity. The locus, composition, and causal generative force of culture are nowhere to be found. There is no smoking gun. There are only the byproducts of culture, our behaviors and thoughts. We are at the crossroads and have been there for a while because we need to think deeper so that we can play that damned guitar with such mastery that we can engage with the complexity of culture, just as philosophers engage with the concept of consciousness or the mind. We need to get back to see that we are a family of enfranchised anthropologists working together to solve this issue, because it is as important an issue as there is. Even if it is impossible to come to a conclusion, we cannot settle for a simple answer as to how culture works, but we must understand the underlying mechanisms of culture. I believe that there is much work in our discipline that can serve as a foundation upon which to develop those criteria so we can move forward, reintroduce, and update the noble, troublesome concept of culture to its rightful place at the center of anthropology. Thank you very much. If you would like a copy of this talk, please email me at demunkv@gmail.com. And if you have any questions, again, email me at demunkv@gmail.com. Bye. From Vilnius.